What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode. Today we have Svea and Jeff with us. What we're going to be doing is breaking down the barbell squat, and honestly any squat in a lot of ways. There's a lot of misconceptions about how to coach it. You see drive your knees out, spread the floor. We're going to kind of put those cues to rest, explain exactly why, and then Jeff is going to actually coach him through a squat so that you can change your squat forms today and get the most out of a phenomenal exercise that has been proven time and time again. So let's go ahead and get into it.
All right, so I'm going to be taking you guys through the squat. I got Svea here to demonstrate the squat form. I'm going to coach him through it. Svea is here with me for a few months at Strength Culture, training with me. He plays football, Division II school up in West Virginia. So Svea is going to step under the bar here. There's a few ways that I teach a squat that are probably quite different from what you're going to pick up from most people online. One of the primary things that I look for is, obviously when you're racking the bar behind your back, there's going to be some degree of shoulder retraction or squeezing together of the shoulder blades, but I don't really want people to overdo this. I find that people can really overemphasize squeezing the upper back, which is really going to lift up their rib cage and sort of externally rotate their rib cage, so their rib cage is sort of flaring out and their back is super arched or extended. So I just want him to naturally sort of set the bar on top of his shoulders and not really think too much beyond that in terms of what he should do with his shoulder blades. So he's going to step out of the rack, he's going to step back, and as you can see, like his rib cage is pretty internally rotated, meaning the rib cage is pulled towards the pelvis. And then from here, all I want him to do is simply bend the knees, and I actually want him to feel pressure on the inside of the foot around the first metatarsal and the inside of the heel, and then he's going to stand up. So I don't teach people to push the knees out or even like torque the ground. So you'll hear spread the floor is another common cue where people heavily supinate the foot and create like a really massive rigid arch in the foot, because it's going to drive tons of external rotation through the foot all the way up to the hip. And the primary issue with that, in my opinion, and it's not even really my opinion, is we need internal rotation to occur when we push into the floor. So even if you were to do like a quick, you can probably rack for a second, even if you were to do a quick test where if I were to have Svea stand here and I wanted him to do a max vertical jump, but I told him that he had to do it by pushing his knees out and going onto the outside edges of the foot, how high do you think you're going to be able to jump doing that? You're not going to be able to produce a lot of force into the ground. But if I just let him bend his knees naturally and sort of pick up the natural internal rotation that's going to occur from the foot up to the hip, he's going to have a way more explosive jump. It's just how we push into the floor. There's no way around it. And if people push out too much, what they're probably going to end up doing, especially with a squat where the bar's on their back, is they're going to end up overextending from the lumbar spine, which that spinal extension is some sort of internal rotation that's occurring. So if you're not allowing foot pronation and all the subsequent internal rotation sort of mechanics to happen from the lower leg, the upper leg, and the hip, you're going to internally rotate too much with the spine and you're going to get a big arch or big extension. And one of the primary issues that people deal with when they're squatting is typically that they feel it too much in their low back, or they're going to get a lot of like lateral knee pain. And so anytime I teach the squat, I teach to just let the knees sort of naturally move towards, I would say, even the first to second toe. Whereas again, in this industry, a lot of times people are taught to torque and rotate their knee out towards like their pinky toe, which just puts a ton of unnecessary torque and stress on the knees and hips and even the back. So we'll have Svea here go ahead and demonstrate a few reps just to see what we mean when we just focus on bending the knees, letting the feet pronate, and letting the whole lower body basically just internally rotate to actually push into the floor. And so as we sit down, you're going to get a lot of that internal rotation. You're going to pick that up, and then to stand up, you're naturally going to get external rotation. So you're going to get both. It's just the real issue becomes that people overemphasize the need for external rotation, and they try to maintain external rotation the entire duration of the lift. So it's pretty simple, and like Svea will probably tell you, when I start to teach them to squat this way, they're obviously very hesitant because it's the opposite of what they've been taught. But primarily what a lot of people will say is that they actually feel quads for the first time. They actually feel like a deep contraction in the glutes, not from just being shoved out and shortened into external rotation, but the fact that they're actually able to properly lengthen and shorten, because now you're actually getting full hip flexion, which now he can actually fully extend the hips. So that's how I teach the squat. I think probably one of the other issues that we'll touch on in a second is that a lot of biomechanics in the way they're applied to squatting in terms of like joint function and how these different joints should function is typically done with like a two-dimensional like outlook. So a lot of people look at a joint on a piece of paper and they're told, well, a hip abducts and extends and externally rotates. But they don't really think about what needs to occur for the joint to do that. And when we go into a closed chain system where our feet are in contact with the floor, the mechanics of what happens to these joints, we need internal and external rotation independently. But once we start doing something like a squat, all of these different joints sequence together, and they all need to be allowed to sequence together that way. So it's just one of those topics that people don't talk about a lot. It's a very simple adjustment that I make to people's squats, is to bend the knees, just focus on pushing the knees over the toes, and everything else just kind of falls into place. People will actually feel, even though they're not bracing, they're going to feel abs for the first time because their hips and rib cage are actually in a better position for the abs to brace. And some people will actually feel hamstrings at that point in a squat because the hamstrings aren't being lengthened. They're actually able to shorten and contribute to hip extension, which is one of the functions of hamstrings. They don't have the best leverage to do it in a squat, but they do still maintain a good rib and pelvis position when we're squatting, which is super important if we want to keep our back healthy and our knees healthy, and then actually grow some solid muscle tissue in the quads and stuff like that when we're squatting. So one thing I want to add is that one of the primary questions that I get when addressing this concept relates more to stance width and toe out. So when I tell people that I want them to squat by initiating by pushing the knees or allowing the knees to travel straight forward over the toes, is a lot of people want to ask about stance width and toe out. So what I tell people is that regardless of your stance width and toe out, you can squat with whatever's comfortable for you. And again, a lot of people will be more comfortable with a little bit of toe out and even a wider stance, especially initially if you lack the range of motion or mobility because of some of the reasons that we discussed in the video. But I just want Svea to demonstrate that even in a wide stance squat, I also don't want you shoving the knees out. The knees are going to go out relative to the stance width and the toe out, right? So regardless of how wide he stands, the mechanics in the initiation of the squat are going to be the same. I just want him to focus on bending the knees and going straight over the toes to where the weight goes to the inside of the foot. So this is just a slightly wider stance, but even if he went sumo and like went really, really wide, again, I'm not going to change the mechanics. And he's obviously going to get more adductor as he goes wider, but I still want to see the knee go towards the inside of the foot. I don't want to see it torque way out. So even if you are one of these individuals who likes a much wider stance squat, or you're doing some sort of like sumo stance where you're way outside of your base of support, the mechanics and how I tell people to initiate the squat are not going to change. We want to just initiate with the knees and let everything else fall into place so we can pick up that internal rotation. It doesn't matter how wide or how narrow you stand, the mechanics aren't going to change. And I'm sure, even Svea here can feel the difference. It's like he's going to feel heavy VMO and adductor as he goes wider, but he doesn't have to change his mechanics up at all in order to squat wide. It's going to be the same thing.
Building off of what we just saw with them squatting, I wanted to show the rib cage model, the pelvis model, and the foot, just to kind of give you guys another lens of looking at everything. For me, this really hit home and kind of tied together some of the dots. Yeah. So he's going to go ahead and get under the bar, and we're going to start off with the rib cage and talk about that common fault that Jeff was saying. Essentially, like he said, external rotation of the rib is going to look like this. So think about flared ribs, think about overarched back. So show me that position. So when you say chest up and squeeze your shoulder blades back, 99% of the people are going to look like this. If you think about having a line here and a line on his belt buckle, those 2 points have just moved all the way away from each other. This is concentric, or it's working really hard, it's tight, and it becomes the main thing that's loaded. And even though it is a back squat, and we absolutely want to train your erectors and your whole back, we really want to make sure your lower body is getting the majority of the load. So that's what that rib flare is going to look like, something that we want to avoid. Simple cue to fix it. Don't ever say chest up or squeeze your shoulder blades back really hard like Jeff said, so even more simple. If someone comes to you and they're already so patterned into this, what I would do is I would just have them look forward. I might even have them relax their knees a little bit more, so maybe, yep. So simply by unlocking your knees, your pelvis kind of goes from that huge tilt and just relax a little bit. And then the final straw would be, give me a nice gentle inhale through your nose and then a long relaxed exhale. After that, their ribs come down and in, going from here to here. I can have them pause for a second. Inhale, fill up your Coke can, fill up your canister, get 360 degrees, whatever cue you want. And now they're in a much better position, as Jeff said, to keep the leverage of your abs, your core, keep the rib cage and the pelvis tied together as we move through the hips and go up and down. So that's a good look at the rib cage. Let's go ahead and look at the pelvis now. All right, next up, taking a look at the pelvis. So I'm gonna keep this really simple. First, we'll start off with a little bit of confusing, but basically at the top of the squat, we're gonna be biased towards external rotation. When we get to that middle point, it's gonna go into a position biased towards internal rotation, and then at the bottom, we're gonna roll back to external rotation. We need to have a good base at the foot to push through the ground, like we said, for internal rotation, but we also need something to happen at the hips and pelvis to allow us to get those hip muscles to really work. The other thing that people are so obsessed with their glutes, but again, pushing the knees out and putting your pelvis in this position. So think like really driven open, butt squeezed, and getting our femurs to rotate out actually shortens the glute in a lot of the tissue here. So if we want something to grow, you want to grow the peach, you want to get really strong, you want to be able to jump higher and do all the great things that squatting will help you with, you need to be able to stretch the glute. And in order to stretch the glute in that middle position, we need to get out of that external rotation, have the pelvis get into a position of internal rotation, which will allow the femur to actually rotate in. Just imagine all the tissue, including the glutes, that's attached back here. And if I just slam it out with my knee, I'm just shortening it the whole time and keeping it short, which is one of the reasons why that feels like crap and you're not as strong. So being able to allow that position to happen, getting the weight to go a little bit more towards the inside of the foot and having that turn in is huge. One last thing that's really common, especially among the, usually the people doing this, the camera's usually set up facing their butthole behind them on the ground, and it's that big tuck under at the top. That's another thing that we'd like you to avoid doing, so that you can see and maybe wondering why a lot of these people actually have a lot of pressure in their sacrum and under their lower back, is at the top when we get into that squat and we finish it and you do this really big tuck and kind of almost round your back. Yes, the glutes do assist in a posterior tilt, but what you're really doing is actually compressing the hell out of your sacrum by coming up and squeezing everything under here. And that's not what we want. And it could even affect your back, because you can see if I smush my sacrum forward, it's only inevitably going to actually affect my lower back as well, instead of keeping that length in what I would describe it as. So that's a look at the pelvis. Now let's go ahead and finish up by looking at the foot. Okay, so last but not least, talking about the foot. So we'll keep this simple as well. Again, we want to be able to get pronation and dorsiflexion. Most people think about pronation as dorsiflexion. They're different or the same. It's not really that important, to be honest, for this conversation. But basically, as the knee travels forward, things have to happen at the foot to allow that to happen. When we supinate really hard and we really kind of screw out like this, we take the foot into this position right here, and it makes it almost impossible to actually get weight onto the inside of the foot and push through it like we demonstrated with the squats. Another thing that needs to happen is the calcaneus needs to actually tip back and get this like anterior tilt really for you to actually get that spread of the bottom of the foot. Another way to think about it, if it's easier for you, is the bottom of the foot needs to open and the top of the foot needs to close. And that's gonna bring length to the bottom of the foot. Similar to the glutes, if you wanna use the stuff on the bottom of the foot and everything that runs into the posterior chain, it's probably a good idea to allow it to stretch so it can load and then bring you back up, which is what your arch does. It spreads and then it contracts. So what we're doing there is also getting weight on the inside. So as this tips forward, it's also going to allow you to tip towards the inside. a really crucial thing, like Jeff was talking about in terms of the controversy of it. What he's saying is you're going to get more load on the inside of your foot. He's not saying lose the entire outside of your foot, collapse your whole ankle in. Those are two completely different things. So it's fully possible to have 3 points of contact and have the inside get heavier during a certain portion of the squat, specifically when you're pushing through the ground. In fact, it would be even optimal if weight was distributed differently through the squat instead of just having it one. So at the top, you're gonna be shifted back a little bit more. As your knees come forward, you're gonna get that spreading action of the bottom of the foot, and you're gonna load into the inside of the foot and the big toe even a little bit more. And again, last but not least, very important, you're not losing the fifth metatarsal, you're not even losing the outside. Even though if you do a little bit, it's not the end of the world, but we're not getting this huge, what you would call an orientation of the whole foot just collapsing inward and putting pressure on the knee. And again, the knee has already gone forward instead of in, okay? And then last but not least, I know we didn't talk about this, but when you are pushing through the ground, this is really common online when we look at like NBA players shooting and stuff, this idea of getting into a triangle like this. Internal rotation is going to also get a little bit of adduction here and there, so it's perfectly normal. If you feel a bunch of stress on the inside of your knees or the front of your hip or the inside of your groin, then obviously it's probably not going too well, but there is a normal amount of that to happen. It's going to be different from everybody. Ultimately, finding the right stance for you, starting slow, progressing over time is obviously the answer for all of this stuff. If you have any questions about that, please let us know, and thanks for tuning in.